On education, Mr. President, last week we heard two unbelievable and frankly horrifying statements from the Trump administration about its push to reopen our schools. On CNN's State of the Union, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos claimed that, quote, "There's nothing in the data that suggests that kids being in school is in any way dangerous," end quote. Late in the week, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany responded to criticism of the president's position on school reopenings, said, quote, "The science should not stand in the way of this," end quote. These comments reflect a president and administration's disregard for the health and safety of our teachers, students, and families. The president and his enablers accuse Democrats of pushing back on his administration's reckless policies for political reasons. The truth is, if there's one thing President Trump has made clear time and again, it's that he doesn't do anything without a self-serving political motive. Come on, we all want our schools to open, including the teachers, parents, and the students I've spoken with. But of course, we want schools to open safely without risking exposure to the virus. And I really don't understand why Betsy DeVos doesn't get this. Reopening our schools safely in the midst of this pandemic would be challenging, even with competent leadership in the White House and the Department of Education. Instead, we have a president and secretary of education who threaten to withhold funding for schools who refuse to reopen, who supports sweeping mandates for schools to reopen before it's safe to do so, who push the CDC to weaken its guidelines on school reopenings. The cavalier disregard for our students, teachers, principals, and administrative staff has produced considerable uncertainty in states and local communities already under tremendous stress during this pandemic. Increasingly, states are forced to create their own guidelines, leaving teachers, students, parents, and principals unsure about how to return to school safely. And this uncertainty is contributing to a growing anxiety across our country. But it's a more proximate concern in Hawaii, where our schools are scheduled to reopen on August 4th, less than 2 weeks away. Earlier this summer, the Hawaii Department of Education and the Hawaii State Teachers Association collaborated on a plan to provide individual schools a measure of freedom to decide how best to begin the school year. At the time, the low numbers of COVID cases provided optimism that some schools could reopen for at least some in-person instruction at the beginning of the school year. An evolving set of facts on the ground, including a rise in new COVID infections in our state, led the Hawaii State Teachers Association to announce its opposition to resuming in-person instruction on August 4th. The Hawaii Government Employees Association, HGAA, and United Public Workers, UPW, represent school support staff, and both unions have joined HSTA in urging the state to delay students returning to classrooms, citing, quote, lack of health strategies to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus on public school campuses, end quote. Their positions reflect the importance of relying on science and public health data to make decisions about our schools. If the circumstances warrant, our policies should change to ensure a safe learning environment. As school districts confront difficult choices with painful trade-offs, our students and educators deserve certainty, resources, and support from the federal government. I heard this message consistently in my conversations with educators and students in Hawaii over the last 2 weeks during our state work period. Teachers are particularly concerned about how looming budget shortfalls in Hawaii could lead to a massive round of teacher layoffs or furloughs and broader budget cuts to education programs. These layoffs and furloughs would have devastating consequences for educators, their families, and the students they teach. An elementary teacher in Kona on Hawaii Island told me how the threat of furloughs and budget cuts are impacting his life. He is the son of Central American immigrants and a first-generation college graduate. He and his fiancée, who is also a teacher, would like to buy a home and start a family, but they can't proceed with their plans under the threat of being furloughed. He's been a teacher for 9 years and loves his job. Teachers are concerned about being forced to return to school to teach without adequate childcare for their own school-aged children, some of whom may be physically in classrooms or not. A middle school teacher in Eva on Oahu had to quit her job and return to Maryland so that her parents could care for her infant daughter. The school has been forced to fill the position with substitute teachers who are not certified. Another major concern for teachers is the learning loss that accelerates when students are not in class. A high school science teacher on Maui is worried that his students do not have the technology and devices they need to be successful in a distance learning model. And teachers there must share computer cards because their school doesn't have enough laptops for each student. He is also worried about how his students will complete their assignments if they are learning from home 2 or more days a week. A teacher at my alma mater, Kaimiki High School, added that many of her students, due to economic necessity, either share laptops or don't have access to a laptop or tablet at home. Student government leaders I've spoken with have also shared their concerns about learning loss and how the pandemic has transformed their educations. A recent graduate headed to college in Boston commented that distance learning was difficult for her to navigate because she did not have access to technology growing up. She described the move to distance learning as frantic and explained that it was discouraging to continue her studies without the student-teacher interactions she previously had. A rising senior at Mo'alanua High School in Honolulu shared how difficult it was to stay motivated through distance learning, especially as his peers stopped participating. He acknowledged that he had probably experienced learning loss. Another senior found it hard to learn online because she is a visual learner. Some of her teachers did not offer visual lessons, so she had to teach herself. She also found that less interaction with teachers made it more difficult to complete her assignments. These stories underscore the urgency and immediacy of the challenges we face in reopening our schools. It's past time for the Senate to step up to confront this crisis in American education. And the first thing we should do is pass the HEROES Act, legislation our colleagues in the House passed over 2 months ago. HEROES provides an additional $90 billion in an education stabilization fund. But we should go even further. Recently, I joined 40 of my Democratic colleagues to request an additional $175 billion for K-12 schools through the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund. And these funds would help schools purchase cleaning supplies and laptop computers and implement programs to make sure we are meeting the social, emotional, and academic needs of our students. Hawaii's superintendent estimated this need would cost $234 million for our students just in Hawaii. We have a statewide school system with about 180,000 students, K-12. These programs are especially important for our vulnerable students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, students with disabilities, English language learners, and others. And we should also pass the Child Care is Essential Act, which would provide $50 billion for child care providers who desperately need financial assistance to continue operating. How can we expect people to go back to work if they don't have child care options? This crisis in American education requires a robust national effort to meet the need. Instead of stepping up to meet this moment, we have a president and an education secretary who have shown they do not care about our students and our teachers. That means the rest of us must care. The Senate, we are a separate co-equal branch of government, must step up to fill this enormous vacuum of leadership by putting the safety of our teachers, our children, before the president's political self-interest. Mr. President, I yield the floor.